Thank you for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Scholz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. Phosphorus moves through soil to our waterways through overland runoff, subsurface flow, and erosion processes. When too much of it reaches the water, it becomes pollution and causes all the ill effects that we're familiar with: algal blooms, dead zones, etc. The soil in a watershed has a certain amount of buffering capacity for phosphorus, but once that capacity is overwhelmed, exports of phosphorus from the land to water can increase dramatically. But how long does it take to reach this point? And then how long does it take for the soil to shed enough of this legacy phosphorus that its buffering capacity is restored? Those are the questions that our guest, Dr. Jean-Olivier Goyette from the University of Montreal in Quebec, and his collaborators address in their recent Nature Geosciences paper entitled Low Buffering Capacity and Slow Recovery of Anthropogenic Phosphorus Pollution in Watersheds. I thought this paper was one of the best phosphorus papers released this year, and certainly one of the most sobering. Jean-Olivier, thank you so much for talking to us on Phosphorus Science Now. I found this paper to be very interesting and also a bit depressing, honestly. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your collaborators' work.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. My collaborators are Roxane Maranger. She's an aquatic ecosystem ecologist. She's based at Université de Montreal in Quebec, in Canada, working on biogeochemical cycles of nutrients and carbon. She works at different scales from genes to watershed, and she does that along the full water continuum from land, rivers, lakes, and coastal systems. Elena Bennett is based at McGill University in Montreal too, and she works on understanding and managing the interaction of multiple ecosystem services at the landscape level. And her work is more grounded in the trade-offs between agriculture and water quality from a phosphorus perspective.
Yeah, great. And I wonder if you could give a little bit background on why you did this research.
Yeah, so let's start at the very beginning. So we know that the increasing use of fertilizers leads to more nutrient runoff and an increasing risk of eutrophication of aquatic systems, and the ensued degradation of water quality has important ecological and social costs. In the 1970s, phosphorus was identified as the main driver of freshwater eutrophication, but despite bans on emissions from point sources since then, eutrophication remains a concern today. So much phosphorus was wasted and lost to the environment within the last century that huge stores of phosphorus have been accumulating within watersheds. And this so-called legacy phosphorus is now acting as diffuse and chronic sources to aquatic systems. In fact, watershed act as buffers by absorbing phosphorus and releasing it gradually to waterways. And according to previous studies, the residence time of phosphorus varies across landscape compartments, going from 5 and 30 years in hill slopes to 1,000 years in riparian zones. But despite this fragmented knowledge across the landscape, we surprisingly lacked an understanding of phosphorus dynamics at the whole watershed scale. And here we just talked about the legacy effect during the depletion phase, but the watershed buffering capacity is also interesting to look at during the phase of accumulation. What we observe, in fact, is that during this accumulation phase, phosphorus accumulates by being retained into aluminum and iron compounds, and it does so until sorption sites reach a certain level of saturation. But beyond that level of retention, capacity is reduced and phosphorus is readily released into the soil solution. But as I said, this idea of saturation threshold has been essentially explored at the agricultural plot scale only. And so whether this phosphorus entering the soil solution really reaches surface water is unknown, because it can be intercepted within other landscape compartments along its way throughout the land-water continuum. But again, this had never been explored at watershed scale, which would capture the effect of the different compartments on buffering phosphorus pollution to surface waters. Okay, so the aim of our study was to answer two questions. First, can we identify a threshold in watershed phosphorus accumulation over which export to aquatic systems would increase? And second, if we were to stop annual excess phosphorus inputs, how long would it take to deplete the legacy phosphorus pool through runoff only? So as a case study, we used the St. Lawrence Basin, located in Quebec, Eastern Canada, to explore these questions, benefiting from the highly heterogeneous landscapes and the important historical land use changes that occurred in the region. And so we reconstructed the accumulation of phosphorus over 110 years in 23 watersheds of the St. Lawrence Basin, and compared these watershed phosphorus levels to riverine loads at watershed outlets. And we used the net anthropogenic phosphorus input approach that was put forward by Russell and colleagues in 2008, and that is based on a similar approach for nitrogen that was published by Bob Howard and colleagues almost 20 years ago. And this approach heavily relies on agricultural censuses, as well as many coefficients from the literature to quantify all fluxes within a system here delimited at the watershed scale. And then considering historical riverine phosphorus exports, we were able to explore the impact of phosphorus accumulation in watersheds on the amount of phosphorus exported to surface waters. And so here we get into the results. So yes, we did detect a phosphorus accumulation threshold where riverine exports became more pronounced. So let me walk you through the graph. Here on the x-axis, we have the stock of phosphorus in watersheds due to accumulation since 1901 in metric tons per square kilometer. And on the y-axis, we have the annual riverine export of phosphorus in kilograms per square kilometer per year. Both axes are log transform, and each data point represents 1 year between 1985 and 2011. And each color delimits a different watershed. And so through this space for time analysis, the most likely value for the threshold detected here is 2.1 metric tons of accumulated P per square kilometer of a watershed.
Yeah, if I can interrupt, is that the same across all soil types, or is that an average across soil types? Or?
Sorry, can you repeat the
Is that
question?
2.1 tons per kilometer squared an average across all soil types, or is it consistent across different types of soils? Or
this 2.1 tons per square kilometer is the most likely value derived from the breakpoint analysis using the space for time approach. So here, aggregating all soil types and watershed characteristics within the same analysis.
It's more an aggregate for this particular watershed.
For the 23 watersheds in the St. Lawrence Basin that we studied.
Great, thanks.
But, however, in the St. Lawrence Basin as a whole, soils are quite typical of many temperate agricultural regions around the world. So with glaze soil intrusions, with clay content that will favor phosphorus retention. So we think that the range of threshold values we observed in the study is probably broadly representative for other systems around the world. Regarding soil types, so for sure variations in clay content, and we think also geomorphometric shape of the basins will likely influence the value of the threshold, but this still need to be tested.
Great, that's clear, thanks.
Yeah, and what surprised us in this analysis was how much this threshold was low. If we compare this value of 2.1 to the most enriched watershed in the study, which we can see on the right part of the graph, levels of accumulated phosphorus in these lie between 25 and 100 tons per square kilometer. So almost 10 to 40-fold higher than the observed threshold here. And so then we just use this critical level in our historical reconstructions of phosphorus accumulation in the 23 watersheds. And we observed that nearly half of the watersheds in this study had already exceeded the threshold before the 60s. So well before the Green Revolution, suggesting a rapid human impacts on the phosphorus buffering capacity of watersheds.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating, Jean-Olivier. And that first one at the bottom, that's 1915, essentially? 1920?
Yeah, 1920. Yep.
Yeah, so decades before the Green Revolutions.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it should give pause to those who think that if we just return to the days of pre-industrial agriculture, everything would be better.
We come to the second question. So asking how long would it take to deplete the phosphorus pools accumulated over the century back to our critical level of 2.1. And to do that, we used the relationship we saw previously to identify phosphorus runoff coefficients that account for the stock of phosphorus contained within the watershed at that time. So since we had multiple years of data per watershed, so from 1985 to 2011, which is the water quality data that we had in hand, we just had multiple phosphorus runoff coefficients that varied across years, much likely in function of annual precipitation. So wet years probably lead to greater export of phosphorus at the outlet, as dry years may favor retention and smaller runoff coefficients. So we use the mean, minimum, and maximum coefficient values per watershed to simulate depletion of phosphorus stocks under different climatic scenarios, either very wet, very dry, or a normal future in terms of precipitation. And to run the simulation, we assume depletion to follow an exponential decay model, as well as we assume no more surplus on the landscape after 2011. And then we kept the coefficients constant throughout the simulation. And so what we get here on the left side, we have those depletion curves in each watershed. And on the right side, we have the time needed to reach the critical point of 2.1 tons per square kilometer. This shows that moderately impacted watersheds, the blue dots, would take between 50 and 500 years to return to baseline, whereas in intensively agricultural watersheds, depletion times may go from 1 to 1.5 thousand years.
Yeah, and this was the really depressing part of the paper I found. Very interesting for sure. I wonder, what is how confident are you in the exponential decay model? Is that the correct mathematical relationship? And I suppose related to that, you couldn't really wait 1,000 years for some of these results to be confirmed. So do you have historical examples where, depletion did occur according to an exponential decay?
Yeah, well, we explored those depletion curves in each of the 22 watersheds separately, but only 2 or 3 of these watersheds showed trends of depletion back to baseline throughout the last 30 years. And so these 30 years that align with water quality time series that we had. And these watersheds were in the low range of phosphorus accumulation among watersheds of the study. I think this is worth noting. And analyses of the hysteresis curves for these watersheds align with results that were presented in the paper, showing a lag effect of nearly 50 years. So this 50 years time lag fits the range of our estimated phosphorus depletion times for pristine watersheds, as we saw on the graph earlier. So yes, there seems to be a certain level of validation of our simulation approach.
Okay, great, thanks. So what's your final conclusion, and where do you see the research going from here?
Well, the final conclusion, as a wrap, the study striked us how fast the phosphorus buffering capacity of watersheds can be overwhelmed when human activity takes place in the landscape, and how slow the recovery could be even under better management practices. So, and we think that with a global population on the rise, that we'll need more food, more clean water, and that is also shifting toward diets of heavy phosphorus footprints. Pressures on watersheds will increase. So there's an urgent need to further reduce phosphorus application, and also to find ways to use these very large pools of legacy phosphorus already stored within the landscape.
Yeah, very interesting. What's next on the research horizon for you? Where do you go with this research from here?
Well, we would like to dig a bit more in a single watershed analysis. As I mentioned earlier about the hysteresis curves, but this is kind of limited by the time span of historical water quality data we have in hands right now. something interesting that would have to be done also, as I also mentioned earlier, is to compare the saturation threshold observed herein to other major watersheds of the world and see what factors drive the variability across those.
Okay, great. Well, congratulations on this fantastic paper, Jean-Olivier, and thank you so much for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now.
Thank you very much.